A silver bracelet lay on the wet asphalt, two faint letters engraved on its surface, Z and M, flickering under the streetlight. It was the last thing her mother left behind before closing her eyes forever. Maeve lay face down on the sidewalk, her lip split, her wrist pinned under a man's boot. The other one was already shoving the bracelet into his coat pocket. 3 years, she had paid her debt without missing a single month. But they didn't come for money, they came for the only thing she would never let go. No one on that street stopped. But a black car pulled over at the end of the alley. The man who stepped out was not a cop, nor some good-hearted passerby. He was Barrett Grayson, a name that half the Chicago underworld didn't dare speak out loud. And on his territory, no one was allowed to step on a woman's hand right in front of him. But what caught Barrett off guard was not the two thugs. It was the girl who stood up after he dealt with them, blood still trickling from the corner of her mouth, staring straight into the eyes of the most powerful man in the city and saying, "I don't need anyone's pity." Barrett had met countless people who knelt before him, but never once had anyone refused the hand he offered. And that was when the real story began. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. The following night, Maeve stood behind the bar at Pete's Corner on the south side, mixing cocktails for a row of regulars whose faces were flushed red from liquor. The place was small, with a low ceiling, and the music was just loud enough that people had to lean close to hear one another clearly. Maeve had worked there for 3 years, 6 nights a week, from 9 o'clock at night until 3 o'clock in the morning. She knew every face in the bar by heart. She knew what each person drank, who liked to start trouble when drunk, who would leave a tip behind, and who would slip out the door the moment she turned her back. Tonight was no different, until a man at the far end of the bar, his eyes already dull and unfocused, reached across the counter and clamped his hand around her wrist. "Hey, sweetheart, pour me another one. Don't make this hard." Maeve looked down at the hand gripping her wrist. She didn't yank away. She didn't shout for anyone. With her other hand, she reached for the soda bottle on the shelf and slammed it hard against the wooden counter. The bottle shattered. The dry crack of exploding glass in that cramped space made the entire bar fall silent. The music was still playing, but no one heard it anymore. Maeve looked straight into the man's eyes, her voice low, each word clear. "Let go. I'm not saying it twice." The man looked at the broken bottle, looked into her eyes, and released her. The people sitting nearby shifted their stools away and turned their faces aside, as if nothing had happened. From the back, the manager, Doug, stepped out with his arms folded across his chest, shaking his head. "Holloway, this is the 3rd time in 2 months. One more time and you're out? You hear me?" Maeve didn't argue. She bent down to pay out the shards of glass and took a towel to wipe the counter. She needed this job. Each month, the bar paid her $2,400, not counting tips. It wasn't enough to live, but it was enough not to die. Her hand moved across the counter slowly and steadily, but it trembled faintly. Not because she was afraid of the drunk customer, because she was tired. The kind of tiredness that seeps into the bones, when the body has grown used to not getting enough sleep for 3 straight years. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Maeve locked the bar door and walked 7 blocks back to her studio apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in Bridgeport. The stairwell had no light, so she climbed each step in the dark from memory. She opened the door and turned on the light. The small room held just enough space for a single bed, a table, and a mini refrigerator. She opened the refrigerator more out of habit than hope. Inside were half a carton of milk and an apple that had already gone a little bruised. She closed the refrigerator and sat down at the table. Across its surface lay the familiar things scattered everywhere: the rent bill, the electric bill, and a stack of documents from Vickers Financial Solutions, the lending company that had followed her for 3 years like a shadow that never left. Maeve turned the silver bracelet around her wrist. 2 small letters were faintly engraved on its face: Z and M, Zara and Maeve. Her mother, Zara Holloway, had bought that bracelet with the last month's wages she earned before she was admitted to the hospital for the final time. Cancer. Found too late. Maeve had been 19 then, alone, signing the consent form for surgery because there was no one else left to sign it. Her mother died 3 weeks after the operation, leaving Maeve the silver bracelet and a hospital bill for $40,000. Maeve had no money. An acquaintance referred her to Vickers Financial Solutions, saying they offered reasonable interest rates and quick paperwork. She signed the loan papers without reading the fine print carefully. 3 years later, 40,000 had swollen into 120,000. Interest gave birth to more interest. Every month, Maeve paid on time, but the money she paid was almost only enough to cover the interest. The principal stood still, like a wall she could never climb over. She picked up the stack of Vickers papers, looked at the bold number printed on the final line, then set it down again. Her eyes drifted to something else on the tabletop, a small black business card, with no name, no logo, only a phone number printed in silver ink. She didn't remember when it had ended up in her coat pocket, but she knew it came from last night, from that alley, from the man who had stepped out of the black car. Maeve picked up the card and turned it over and over between two fingers. Then she laid it back on the table, stood up, turned off the light, and lay down on the bed. She didn't call. She didn't know who that man was, but she knew one thing. People who drove black cars through the South Side in the middle of the night and made thugs run with 2 words weren't the kind of people who gave anyone anything for free. And Maeve Holloway had already owed enough. The next morning, Flint placed a folder on Barrett's desk. Vickers Financial Solutions, Flint said. The owner is Ronan Vickers, 40 years old. On paper, it's a legitimate finance company specializing in personal loans. In reality, it's cutthroat interest rates, contracts written in tiny fine print, and when debtors fall behind, instead of lawyers, he sends 2 guys like the ones from last night. Flint turned to the next page. They operate mostly on the South Side, but they've expanded into Bridgeport and back of the yards over the past 2 years. He's squeezing at least several hundred small debtors in the area, most of them working people, single mothers, and elderly people living on pensions. Barrett read the file, his face showing nothing. Who gave him permission to operate on the South Side? He asked. Flint shook his head. No one. He did it on his own. Maybe he thought lending to poor people was too small for anyone to notice. Barrett closed the folder and stood. Arrange a meeting. Today. That afternoon, Barrett arrived at the Vickers Financial Solutions office on the 6th floor of an old commercial building in Chinatown. He didn't come alone. Flint walked on his right, and 2 others followed behind, all of them in suits, all of them silent. The receptionist in the lobby watched the 4 men walk in and was about to ask whether they had an appointment. But when she looked into Flint's eyes, she decided not to ask any more. She picked up the phone and called inside. And 30 seconds later, the door to Ronan Vickers' office opened. Ronan Vickers was the kind of man who tried to look more important than he really was. The office was spacious, with a large oak desk, a leather chair, fake certificates hanging on the wall, and framed photographs of him standing with a few third-rate local politicians. He rose when Barrett walked in, his mouth spreading into a smile as if he were welcoming an old friend. Barrett Grayson, it's been a long time. Please, sit. Something to drink? I have an 18-year Macallan someone just gave me. Barrett didn't sit. He stood in front of Ronan's desk, his hands resting at his sides, looking at him with flat, quiet gray eyes. Flint and the 2 men stood behind him, blocking the doorway completely. Ronan's smile slowly faded. What's this about? Barrett didn't answer right away. He took a white envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and placed it on the oak desk, directly in front of Ronan. One of your debtors, Barrett said. Name is Holloway. A $40,000 principal that you inflated into $120,000 with interest rates that any court would call illegal. That $80,000 in interest. Erase it. Inside the envelope is the difference between what she's already paid and the original principal. The remaining $40,000 she'll pay herself, at the proper legal interest rate. Ronan looked at the envelope, then at Barrett, trying to keep his voice calm. Barrett, she's just a small debtor. I have hundreds of cases like that. Why do you care about some bartender? Barrett didn't answer the question. He placed both hands on the desk, leaned forward, and his voice dropped lower, slower, every word heavy as stone. You're lending on the South Side. The South Side is mine. Every debtor you squeeze here, you're squeezing inside my pocket. Every thug you send out to collect on my streets, you're sending men to operate on my territory without permission. He leaned closer. Erase Miss Holloway's interest. And if I hear your name on the South Side one more time, I won't bring an envelope again. There was no more 18-year Macallan, no more old friend's smile. Ronan swallowed, looked at the envelope, looked at Barrett, then looked at the 3 men standing in front of the door. He nodded. Barrett straightened, buttoned his suit jacket, turned, and walked out. No handshake, no goodbye, The meeting lasted less than 4 minutes. In the car, Flint drove across the bridge toward the West Loop. There was silence for a while. Then Flint glanced into the rearview mirror and asked, "Because of the girl?" Barrett didn't look at Flint. He looked out through the car window, where the late afternoon light lay over the old buildings of the South Side. "Because of the South Side," he said. Flint nodded and asked nothing more, but he noticed that Barrett kept looking out the window longer than usual, and the silence after that answer didn't feel like Barrett's ordinary silence. It was heavier, as if something had just begun, something Barrett himself couldn't yet name. 3 days after the meeting between Barrett and Ronan, Maeve's phone rang while she was washing glasses at Pete's corner. A cold female voice from Vickers Financial Solutions informed her that her debt had been adjusted. The accrued interest, totaling $80,000, had been erased. The remaining balance was $40,000 in principal, which would now be charged interest at the federal standard rate. Maeve stood in the middle of the bar, still holding the wet glass in her hand, and said nothing for 10 seconds. The receptionist asked, "Miss Holloway, are you still there?" Maeve hung up. She wasn't happy. She was furious. The kind of fury that boiled up from the stomach and caught in the throat, because she knew exactly who had done this. She knew because there was no miracle in this world that would make a predatory lending company suddenly erase $80,000 for a bartender. There was only one person who had stepped into her life by shoving a thug into a wall in a dark alley, and that person had left behind a black business card with no name. Maeve waited until her shift was over. At 3 o'clock in the morning, once she got back to her studio, she sat down at the table, picked up the business card, and dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times. "Speak," Barrett's voice answered, brief and blunt, without asking who was calling. "I just got a call from Vickers Financial," Maeve said, her voice trying to stay calm, though it trembled faintly at the end of the sentence, not from fear, but from anger. "Who gave you the right to interfere in my business? I didn't ask you to pay my debt. I don't know who you are, and I don't want to owe anyone else." Silence stretched for 2 seconds on the other end of the line. Then Barrett spoke, his voice as flat and still as the surface of a lake. "I didn't pay your debt. I cleaned trash off my land. That interest was illegal, and Vickers was operating on my territory without permission. The remaining $40,000 is yours. I didn't touch that." Maeve clenched her teeth. "Then the money in the envelope you gave Ronan, I'll pay it back. Every penny." Silence again. Then Barrett spoke, and Maeve could hear something in his voice that she couldn't quite name. Maybe surprise. Maybe only amusement. "Then pay it back. I'm not in a hurry." Then he hung up. Maeve sat there staring at the phone, her hand gripping it so tightly the back of her hand turned white. She wanted to throw the phone against the wall, but she didn't, because she didn't have the money to buy a new one. 2 weeks later, everything collapsed another level. Pete, the bar owner, announced that he was selling the property. The South Side was being redeveloped. Rent had doubled, and Pete couldn't carry the burden anymore. The bar would close at the end of the month. Maeve lost her job. She started looking for a new place, but her terrible credit history slammed every door shut. Every place where she submitted an application ran a financial background check, and when they saw an unpaid $40,000 debt, along with a history of late payments, no one wanted to risk hiring a bartender carrying that much legal baggage. Next month's rent was coming due. The refrigerator was empty. Her bank account had less than $200 left. Maeve sat in the dark studio, the small desk lamp casting a weak yellow light over the 3 things in front of her: the rent bill, the silver bracelet on her wrist, and the black business card. She looked at those 3 things for a long time. The bill was the present, the bracelet was the past, and the business card was a door she had sworn she would never walk through. But vows belonged to people who still had choices. Maeve Holloway had no choices left. She picked up the phone and dialed the number. This time, it rang twice. "Speak. Is that job still available?" Maeve asked, her voice no longer trembling, only dry and straight as a wire pulled taut. "It is," Barrett said. "I'll take it," Maeve said. "But I have conditions. I work, I get paid, and the debt is deducted from my wages little by little. I don't owe anyone another cent, and don't ever call it a favor." Silence held for 1 second. Then Barrett said, "Fine. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock in the morning. Greystone Restaurant, Michigan Avenue." The call ended. Maeve set the phone down, looked at the black business card one last time, then tore it in half and threw it into the trash. She didn't need it anymore. Not because she had memorized the phone number, but because she wanted to remind herself that this wasn't the beginning of gratitude. This was a transaction, and Maeve Holloway always paid what she owed. That evening, after hanging up with Maeve, Barrett didn't go back to the office. He told Flint to drive to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, to the special care unit on the 12th floor. Flint didn't ask why. He knew what the 12th floor meant. It was where Conrad Grayson, the man who had built the Grayson Empire from nothing with his own 2 hands more than 30 years ago, was lying in a hospital bed with a ventilator mask attached to his face, and IV lines running into his thin, bony arms. Barrett stepped into the hospital room and closed the door softly behind him. The room was quiet, with only the steady sound of the ventilator and the blinking pulse of the monitor. Conrad lay turned slightly against the raised pillows, his eyes closed. But when Barrett pulled out a chair and sat down beside the bed, the old man opened his eyes, gray eyes, exactly like Barrett's, but now clouded and deeper, like 2 wells slowly running dry. "Son," Conrad said, his voice hoarse and weak, each word broken by a breath from the machine. "It's been a long time." Barrett didn't correct him by saying he had only been there 4 days ago. He only said, "Are you feeling any better?" Conrad gave a faint laugh, the laugh of a man who had lived too long to lie to himself anymore. "I'm lying here, full of tubes, and you're asking if I'm feeling any better." Barrett didn't laugh with him. He sat still, both hands resting on his thighs, his back straight, as if he were sitting in a boardroom instead of a hospital room. But Conrad looked at his son and saw things no one else could see. He saw the 10-year-old boy sitting in the hospital hallway, waiting for his mother's surgery, not crying. He saw the 15-year-old standing beside his mother's coffin, his face hard as stone, his hands clenched at his sides. That boy was 33 now, dressed in a black suit, running an underground empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he still didn't know how to cry. "How's work?" Conrad asked. Barrett answered briefly. "Fine. Everything's running." "Southside?" "Handled. There was a loan shark operating on our land. It's been cleaned up." Conrad gave a small nod. He didn't ask how it had been cleaned up. He had taught Barrett how to clean things up since his son was 20, and he trusted that Barrett cleaned more thoroughly than he ever had. Silence stretched between them. The ventilator breathed in its steady rhythm. Then Conrad turned his head on the pillow and looked straight into his son's eyes. "Barrett," he said, and his voice changed. No longer the voice of a father making conversation with his son, but the voice of a man who knew he didn't have many chances left to speak. "Are you living the right way?" Barrett didn't answer. He looked at his father, and for the first time that evening, something stirred inside his cold gray eyes. Only for an instant, quick as the shadow of a cloud passing over the surface of a lake. Then it was gone. Conrad didn't wait for an answer. He knew his son. He knew Barrett wouldn't answer because Barrett didn't know the answer. "I built this empire with my whole life," Conrad said, each word slow, his breathing heavy between every sentence. "I poured everything into it. Time, strength, and things I can't take back. But I don't want you to die inside it, Barrett. I didn't build it to lock you in." Barrett sat motionless for a long time. Then he reached out and took his father's hand at the edge of the bed. Conrad's hand, once hard as iron, was now thin and light, the bones rising beneath the skin. Barrett held it gently, without squeezing, as if he were afraid that hand might break. He said nothing. He didn't know what to say, and perhaps nothing needed to be said, because Conrad closed his eyes, and his breathing slowed, steadied, and sank into sleep. Barrett stood, released his father's hand, and stepped out into the hallway. Flint was leaning against the opposite wall with his arms folded, looking up when he saw him. "Are you all right, boss?" Barrett buttoned his suit jacket, his face returning to its flat stillness. "I'm fine," he said. Then he walked down the hallway toward the elevator, with Flint following behind him. But as he passed the waiting chairs outside the corridor, Barrett stopped for 1 second and rested one hand on the back of a plastic chair. Flint saw his knuckles clench so tightly they turned white, as if that chair were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Then Barrett let go, kept walking, stepped into the elevator, rode down to the lobby, and went out to the car. He didn't look back. On the way home, the head doctor called Flint's phone, asking him to pass along to Barrett that Conrad's condition was worsening faster than expected, and that the family should prepare. Flint looked into the rearview mirror and saw Barrett sitting still, staring out the window, and decided not to tell him yet. Not now. Maeve arrived at Greystone Restaurant at 6:45 in the morning, 15 minutes earlier than the appointment time. The restaurant sat on Michigan Avenue, with a black glass front, a small, neat bronze sign, nothing showy. Yet it carried the kind of elegance that made passers-by understand this wasn't a place meant for someone to step into for a takeaway coffee. The restaurant manager, a middle-aged man named Walsh, met her at the back door. He looked her up and down, not hiding his suspicion, but he asked nothing except, "Miss Holloway? The boss said you're in charge of managing the afternoon and evening shifts, starting today." Maeve nodded and didn't ask anything else. She began working on the very first day as though she had been there the entire year. During the first month, Maeve didn't speak privately with anyone beyond work. She arrived early, left late, and checked everything from the reservation book to the quality of every plate that came out of the kitchen. She didn't ask about Barrett. She didn't ask what this restaurant was a front for. She didn't ask why certain corner tables were always kept empty even when customers were waiting. She knew what world she was standing in. But she had come here to pay off a debt, not to be curious. At first, the restaurant staff watched her with measuring eyes, whispering that she was the boss's person. But after 2 weeks of seeing her work 12 hours a day, inspect inventory more carefully than Walsh, and handle customer complaints with a calm, professional voice, no one whispered anymore. Barrett occasionally stopped by the restaurant without warning, sitting at his usual corner table deep inside, beside the window overlooking the alley. He drank black coffee, didn't eat, and sat alone or with Flint, reading documents or talking on the phone. Maeve served him like any other customer. She set the cup of coffee on the table, asked whether he needed anything else, and when he said no, she turned and walked away. She didn't bow any lower. She didn't linger any longer. She didn't look into his eyes longer than necessary. Barrett said nothing about it. But Flint noticed that each time Maeve turned her back and walked away, Barrett watched her for 1 second longer before returning to his papers. One Tuesday night, the restaurant closed at 11 o'clock. The staff left one by one. Maeve stayed behind to clean the main dining room, straighten the tables and chairs, and wipe down the bar. She didn't know Barrett was still sitting at his usual corner table until she came back with a towel and saw him there, his coffee long since empty, watching her. "The restaurant is closed," Maeve said, her voice normal, as if reminding any customer who had stayed past closing time. "I know," Barrett said. Silence. Maeve continued wiping the nearby table. Barrett looked at her wrist, where the silver bracelet caught the light each time she moved her hand across the tabletop. "I want to ask you something," he said. Maeve didn't stop wiping. "Ask." "That bracelet, that night in the alley, you held onto it so tightly you let 2 guys twice your size knock you down. What makes it so important?" Maeve stopped. She straightened and looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. The 2 letters, Z and M, were faintly engraved beneath the restaurant's pale yellow light. She didn't look at Barrett when she spoke. She looked at the bracelet. "My mother bought it with her last month's wages before she went into the hospital for the final time," she said, her voice flat, neither high nor low, as if she were reading a line from a bill. "She was very sick, and she knew she wouldn't make it. On the last day she was clear enough to talk, she gave me this bracelet and said, 'I couldn't leave you anything, but when you look at this, remember that I was here.'" Maeve didn't cry. When she finished speaking, she set the towel on the table, picked up the tray from the counter, and walked into the kitchen to finish cleaning the rest. She didn't look back at Barrett, didn't wait for a reaction, didn't say more. She told it as a fact, because it was a fact, and facts didn't need people to decorate them with tears. Barrett remained seated at the table for another 5 minutes after Maeve went into the kitchen. He didn't call her back, didn't thank her for sharing, didn't offer a single word of comfort. He only sat there, looking at the place where Maeve had just been standing, then rose, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out through the back door. Flint drove him home. That night, Barrett didn't go home. He went up to the office on the 4th floor of an old building in the West Loop, where he often sat alone when he didn't want anyone to see him. He sat down in the chair, turned on the desk lamp, and opened the lower left drawer, the drawer he rarely opened. Inside was an old photograph, its edges yellowed with age. In the picture was a young woman with black hair, bright eyes, and a radiant smile, holding a small child in her arms. His mother, dead when Barrett was 10 years old, cancer, just like Maeve's mother. Barrett looked at the photograph for a long time, his finger brushing lightly over the glass of the frame. Then he placed it back in the drawer, closed it, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark. 1 week after the night Barrett stayed late at the restaurant, a woman walked into Greystone at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right when the restaurant was at its emptiest. She didn't have a reservation. She didn't need one. The hostess saw her and immediately led her to the best table in the center section without asking a single question. Maeve was checking the reservation book near the counter when she sensed the change in the restaurant's air. The staff moved faster, spoke more softly, and stood a little straighter. She looked up and saw the woman seated alone at the center table, her dark blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, a long cream-colored coat over her shoulders, everything on her expensive but not flashy, the kind of elegance that belonged to someone born rich, not someone newly rich and eager to show it. She ordered a glass of water, then looked straight toward the counter where Maeve was standing, and summoned her with the slight lift of one finger. Maeve walked to the table. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you need anything else?" The woman didn't answer right away. She looked Maeve up and down, slowly, thoroughly, with the gaze of someone assessing an item on a shelf to decide whether it had any value. Then she smiled, a thin smile as sharp as a paper cutter's blade. "Sit down," she said. Maeve didn't sit. "I'm working, ma'am. I know you're working. Sit down. Just 1 minute." Maeve looked at her, then pulled out the chair and sat across from her, not because she was obeying, but because she wanted to know who this woman was, the kind of woman who could make the whole restaurant change its breathing the moment she walked in. "I'm Sloane Mercer," the woman said, her voice gentle and measured, as if she were introducing herself at a charity luncheon. "Maybe you haven't heard my name, but that's all right. You don't need to know much. You only need to know one thing." She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table in front of her. "My family and the Grayson family have had an arrangement since Conrad, Barrett's father, was still healthy. An engagement. Barrett and I are going to marry to unite the two organizations. That isn't gossip. It isn't hope. It's an agreement between two families that has existed for many years." Sloane paused, took a sip of water, then set the glass back down in exactly the same place on the coaster. "I'm not here to make trouble for you, Maeve. I'm here because I think you deserve to know the truth, so you can understand your place here. You're an employee, nothing more. Barrett may find you interesting because you're different from the people he usually meets. But interesting passes quickly. An arrangement between two families doesn't." Maeve had sat still from the beginning. She didn't interrupt, didn't frown, didn't clench her hands under the table. She listened, and she understood. Not that Sloane was right, but what kind of person Sloane was. The kind who used the truth as a weapon, wrapped in politeness so the other person couldn't react without making herself look rude. Maeve stood, pushed the chair back into place, looked at Sloane, and spoke in the same voice she used with every customer. "I know my place. I'm working." Then she turned and walked away. Not fast, not slow, and without looking back. Sloane watched her go, and the smile on her lips disappeared. Not because Maeve had said anything devastating, because Maeve hadn't said anything devastating at all. Sloane had prepared for anger, for tears, for pleading, for any reaction she could use as proof that Maeve was weak. But Maeve gave her nothing, and that was what irritated Sloane most. Sloane left the restaurant 10 minutes later without ordering anything else. Maeve continued working until the end of her shift, as if that conversation had never happened. She checked the kitchen, signed the delivery log, handled a complaint about a reservation booked at the wrong time, then closed the restaurant at 11 o'clock at night. When she got back to her studio, she showered, changed clothes, lay down on the bed, and stared up at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. She wasn't jealous. She had no right to be jealous. Barrett Grayson wasn't her lover, wasn't her husband, wasn't anyone who belonged to her. He was the owner of the restaurant where she worked to pay off a debt. That was all. But lying there in the dark, turning the silver bracelet around her wrist, Maeve wondered what kind of world she was stepping into. A world with men who drove black cars through the night, with corner tables that were always kept empty, with white envelopes placed on oak desks, and with women in cream-colored coats who came to a restaurant at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to tell her she was nothing. Maeve closed her eyes. She didn't belong to that world. But she didn't belong to any other world anymore either. 3 days after the meeting with Sloane, Maeve arrived at the restaurant early in the morning as usual and found Walsh, the general manager, waiting for her at the back door with a tense face. "Holloway, there's a problem," he said. The cash safe at the end of last night's shift was short $15,000. Last night's shift was yours. Maeve looked at Walsh. I locked the safe at 10:45, exactly according to procedure. Check the cameras again. Walsh shook his head. Already checked. The kitchen angle camera near the safe went out for 12 minutes, from 10:20 to 10:32. That's exactly when the money disappeared. And the shift handover log clearly says you were the last person to open the safe. He handed Maeve a stack of papers. The boss wants to see you. Now. Maeve walked into the small office behind the restaurant. Barrett sat behind the desk, and Flint stood in the corner of the room. On the desk was an open file, printed camera stills, the shift handover log, and the safe inventory receipt. Barrett didn't stand up. He didn't offer her a seat. He pushed the file toward Maeve and said one word. Explain. Maeve picked up the file and read every page. The camera printout showed a blurred image for 12 minutes. Then it returned to normal. The shift handover log had her signature on the final line. The inventory receipt clearly recorded the missing money. Everything pointed straight at her. Neat, clean, and so perfect it didn't feel natural. Maeve set the file down on the desk. She looked straight into Barrett's eyes and said, I didn't take it. Everything here points to me. But I didn't take it. If you believe I did, fire me. But I'm not begging anyone for mercy. Barrett looked at her, his gray eyes showing nothing, exactly like the first night in the dark alley. I don't convict anyone without enough evidence, he said. But I don't overlook things either. $15,000 doesn't disappear by itself. Maeve nodded and turned to leave. She didn't ask for more time. She didn't offer another word in her own defense. She knew words proved nothing. Only evidence could prove anything. That night, after the restaurant closed and the last employee went home, Maeve didn't go home. She stayed alone in the dark restaurant, turned on the computer at the reception counter, and started digging. She opened the camera system and rewound the footage from the night before. Just as the report said, the kitchen angle camera went dark for 12 minutes. But Maeve didn't stop there. She checked the system journal, the log that recorded every action inside the camera software, and she found it. At 10:19, 1 minute before the camera went dark, there had been a manual shutdown command from an administrator account. That account wasn't hers. She didn't have administrator access to the camera system. She only had viewing access, not editing access. Maeve wrote down the account code, then opened this month's shift handover book. She read every line, comparing the work schedules of all the employees, and she found one detail. A morning shift manager named Pruitt had been hired the same week she started working there. Maeve hadn't interviewed Pruitt, hadn't approved his paperwork, and didn't even know who had referred him. She checked Pruitt's schedule and saw that on the night the money disappeared, Pruitt hadn't been scheduled for a shift, but the system recorded his keycard being swiped at the back door at 10:17, 2 minutes before the camera was turned off. Maeve sat back in the chair and stared at the screen. Everything fit. Someone had enough power to place an employee inside Barrett's restaurant without needing her approval. Someone had enough influence to bribe a manager with system access. And someone wanted her gone from this place badly enough to stage a perfect trap. Maeve knew only one person who fit all three. The next morning, Maeve came to Barrett's office before the restaurant opened. She didn't knock. She walked straight in. Barrett was sitting behind the desk with Flint, and both of them looked up at her. Maeve placed a stack of papers on the desk, directly in front of Barrett. The camera system log shows a manual shutdown command from an administrator account at 10:19. 1 minute before the camera went dark, she said, her voice clear, each sentence short and precise, as if she were presenting a report. That account isn't mine. I don't have administrator access. The morning shift manager named Pruitt was hired the week I started working. I didn't interview him. I didn't approve him. Pruitt's keycard was swiped at the back door at 10:17 that night, even though he wasn't scheduled. Someone with access to your restaurant system framed me. Barrett looked at the papers, then at her. Flint stepped forward and flipped through the pages. Barrett asked, "Do you know who's behind it?" Maeve didn't blink. "Sloan Mercer. And if you don't handle it, I'll go talk to her myself." Barrett looked at her for one more second. "No need. I'll handle it." Maeve didn't back down. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm informing you." Then she turned and walked out, going straight down to the restaurant to start her shift as usual. That day, 2 things happened. First, Pruitt was called into Barrett's office. 10 minutes later, he walked out, his face drained white. carrying a box of his personal belongings straight to the door without looking at anyone. No one asked why. Second, Barrett went to see Sloane. Not at the restaurant. Not at some polite coffee shop. He went straight to the Mercer family office in the Gold Coast, sat down across from Sloane in her sitting room, and spoke in the voice he used when he didn't intend to repeat himself. You nearly cost me an employee because of your game. The engagement is my father's business. My father arranged it. My father decided it. But while my father is still lying in a hospital bed, you don't touch my people, my property, or anyone who works for me. This isn't a warning, Sloane. This is a boundary. Sloane sat still the whole time, her hands folded in her lap, her face revealing nothing. When Barrett stood to leave, she said, I understand. Her voice was soft and polite, but the eyes that followed Barrett as he walked out the door were colder than when he had walked in. The kind of cold only people who know how to wait can have. 2 weeks after the setup, Barrett's phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. He was sitting in his office in the West Loop, still awake, reading financial reports from the businesses. The number calling was from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. He answered, said nothing except 2 words, I'm coming, then hung up, stood, and took the car keys from his desk. For the first time in many years, he didn't call Flint. He drove himself. The hospital, close to 3 o'clock in the morning, was so quiet that the sound of Barrett's shoes striking the floor of the 12th floor hallway felt like a countdown. The head doctor met him outside the recovery room and spoke briefly. Conrad had suffered acute respiratory failure. He had been intubated. His condition was critical, and his lungs had almost stopped functioning. The doctor said a few more things about the treatment plan, about percentages, about the chance of recovery, but Barrett didn't hear them. He looked through the small glass window in the recovery room door and saw his father lying on the bed, his body covered with wires and plastic tubes, his chest rising and falling to the rhythm of the ventilator, not to the rhythm of his own breath. Barrett stood in the hallway and didn't go inside. He leaned his back against the wall, both hands hanging at his sides, his head lowered. He didn't cry. Barrett Grayson hadn't known how to cry since he was 10 years old, but he stood there, silent, and anyone who saw him in that moment would have understood that silence was heavier than any sob. Flint arrived 15 minutes later, probably because someone at the hospital had called him. Flint stood at the end of the hallway, looked at Barrett leaning against the wall, and decided not to come closer. He knew when Barrett wanted to be alone, but Flint did one thing he didn't know would change that entire night. He texted Maeve, not because Barrett told him to. Barrett didn't tell anyone anything. Flint texted because after nearly 10 years following Barrett, this was the first time he had ever seen Barrett not know what to do. Maeve arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning. She took a taxi from Bridgeport to Northwestern, wearing a thin coat over her pajamas, her hair tied back in a rush. She stepped out of the elevator on the 12th floor and saw Flint standing at the end of the hallway. He pointed toward the far end, where Barrett stood. Maeve walked over and stopped a few steps away from him. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't touch him. She went to the vending machine in the corner of the hallway, dropped in some coins, took out a hot cup of black coffee, then came back and stood beside Barrett. She held out the cup without saying a word. Barrett didn't look at her. He didn't lift his head. He didn't turn. But his hand reached out and took the coffee. The two of them stood like that in the hospital hallway for a very long time. Not speaking, not looking at each other, just standing side by side beneath the cold white fluorescent lights, listening to the sound of the ventilator echo through the closed door, and drinking coffee from a vending machine. The next morning, Conrad woke up. The doctor said this might be a temporary rally, and the family should come in to see him. Barrett walked into the room and sat beside the bed. Conrad opened his eyes, looked at his son, and the first thing he said, in a voice so weak Barrett had to lean close to hear it, was, "Who was the girl standing in the hallway with you last night?" Barrett didn't ask how his father knew. Maybe a nurse had told him. Maybe Conrad had heard her footsteps. "She works for me," Barrett said, "at the restaurant." Conrad gave a faint smile, tired and thin. "Bring her in here. I want to meet the girl my son saved in an alley." Barrett wanted to refuse, but he looked into his father's eyes and saw something he couldn't say no to. The last curiosity of a man who knew he wouldn't have much longer to be curious. He went outside and called Maeve in. Maeve stepped into the hospital room and stopped at the foot of the bed. Conrad looked at her, his dim gray eyes moving across her face, and he gave a small nod, as if confirming something he had already guessed. "Come here," he said. Maeve walked closer and stood beside the bed. Conrad asked her a few simple questions. What she had done before coming to the restaurant, where she lived, whether she had family. Maeve answered briefly, without dressing anything up, without turning her life into a tragedy. Bartender, Bridgeport. No. Conrad listened, then stayed silent for a while. Then he turned his head toward Barrett, who stood in the corner of the room, and said, his voice weak but each word clear, "She isn't afraid of you. Hold on to the people who aren't afraid of you, Barrett. They're the only ones who'll tell you the truth." Barrett didn't answer. Maeve didn't either. She stood still, watching the old man in the hospital bed say those words to his son, and she understood that this wasn't praise for her. This was the final instruction of a father. Conrad Grayson died at 9 o'clock the following night, quietly, in his sleep, without pain. The doctor said he passed gently. Barrett heard the news over the phone while sitting in his car outside the hospital gates. He hung up, set the phone down, and sat motionless in the car for 30 minutes before starting the engine and driving away. Barrett didn't attend the public funeral. The Grayson organization held a large service, crowded, formal, done according to every proper ritual. But Barrett wasn't there. He came to the cemetery at 5 o'clock the next morning, while the sky was still dark, and stood alone in front of his father's grave, both hands in his pants pockets, his face turned toward the new stone marker. He stood there until the sky began to lighten, then turned and walked back toward the car. Maeve was sitting in the passenger seat. She didn't say how she got there. She didn't explain why she knew he would be here at this hour. She only sat there, both hands resting on her lap, looking straight ahead. Barrett opened the door, got into the driver's seat, and didn't look surprised, as if he had known she would be there, or as if he had hoped she would be there. Silence stretched between them. Then Maeve spoke, her voice gentle but not soft, the voice of someone who spoke plainly, out of respect, not out of cruelty. "You don't have to answer anyone today, but don't let that question die with him." Barrett sat still, both hands on the steering wheel. He didn't ask which question Maeve meant. He knew, and he knew Maeve knew. This was the first time in Barrett Grayson's life that someone had told him exactly what he needed to hear without fearing him, without needing him, without wanting anything from him. He looked at her, and in the cold gray eyes of the most powerful boss in Chicago, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, like a tiny crack across the surface of stone, the kind you wouldn't see unless you looked closely, but the crack was there, and it would never heal. The news of Conrad Grayson's death spread through Chicago's underworld in less than 24 hours, and Sloan Mercer was one of the first people to realize that the old man's death didn't just leave an empty place in a hospital bed. It left a crack in the wall of power Barrett was trying to hold together. Sloan knew very well that Barrett had just lost his father, had just drawn a boundary in front of her, and more importantly, he was trying to change the way the organization operated, moving it gradually toward legitimacy, something not every senior member agreed with. There were men inside the Grayson organization who had followed Conrad for 30 years, and they didn't want the empire they had built with sweat to be turned into a real estate company by a 33-year-old boy. Sloan saw all those broken pieces, and she knew how to fit them into a weapon. 1 week after the funeral, Sloan met Ronan Vickers at a bar in Irving Park, outside Barrett's territory. Ronan came with the face of a man whose house had just burned down, and who still had to meet someone capable of setting fire to it again. Barrett had taught him 2 lessons, and he didn't want a third. But Sloan didn't need Ronan to be brave. She needed him to be greedy. "Barrett isn't the same Barrett he was half a year ago," Sloan said, her voice gentle, as if she were talking about the weather. "He's losing support from the inside. Some people want a change in leadership. He's more concerned with a waitress than with the empire his father built. You attack from the outside, and I'll provide information from the inside. Together, we push Barrett into a position where he can't keep both." Ronan sipped his drink and thought. He remembered Barrett's gray eyes watching him across the oak desk. Remembered the words, "I won't bring an envelope again." But he also remembered the $80,000 that had been erased, remembered the humiliation of having to bow his head in front of his own men. Ronan nodded. 10 days later, Maeve closed Greystone Restaurant at 11 o'clock at night, as usual. She said goodbye to the last employee leaving, locked the back door, and began walking back to her studio in Bridgeport. The night was cold, the streets empty, and Maeve walked quickly, both hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. She had gone 3 blocks when she realized there were footsteps behind her. Not one person, more than one. She didn't turn around. She only walked faster. But when she turned into the familiar shortcut alley between 2 old buildings, 3 figures were already standing at the far end, blocking the way out. Maeve stopped, turned back. 2 more figures stood behind her, blocking the way she had come in. 5 men. She recognized one of them, the big man who had pinned her wrist to the asphalt that first night. This time, he didn't laugh. He didn't make a joke. He stepped forward, grabbed Maeve by the collar, and shoved her into the brick wall behind her. Her back struck the wall, and her breath was cut short. Maeve didn't scream. She looked straight into his eyes, and her hand moved on instinct, striking him across the face. The man reeled for 1 second. Then the second man at her side grabbed her hair and yanked her backward. The third man saw the silver bracelet on Maeve's wrist, glinting beneath the streetlight that spilled into the alley. He grabbed the bracelet and pulled hard. Maeve tightened her wrist and held on. She knew she couldn't beat 3 men twice her size, but she didn't let go. She never let go of that bracelet. The man pulled a second time, harder, and the chain cut into the skin of Maeve's wrist before it snapped. The silver bracelet fell into his hand. Maeve reached out, trying to snatch it back, but he shoved her to the ground. The big man bent down, looked at her lying on the cold pavement, and said, "Leave, Barrett, or next time, it won't be the bracelet you lose." Then all 3 turned and walked away, fast and clean, disappearing into the darkness at the end of the alley, as if they had never been there at all. Maeve lay on the ground, her back against the brick wall, breathing hard. Her left cheek was bruised, her hair was a mess, and the shoulder of her coat was torn. But she didn't look at any of that. She looked down at her left wrist, empty. The red mark where the bracelet had cut into her skin still burned, but the bracelet was gone. For the first time in 3 years, her wrist was bare. For the first time since the day her mother had given her that bracelet on a hospital bed and told her, "When you look at this, remember that I was here." There was nothing left on her wrist. Maeve sat with her back against the wall, staring at her bare wrist, and cried. Not loudly, not with sobs, not with a scream. Tears slid silently down her bruised cheek, and she let them fall because she no longer had the strength to hold them back. Through 3 years of paying her debt without missing a month, she hadn't cried. The night she was shoved down in the alley for the first time, she hadn't cried. Losing her job, running out of money, sleeping hungry, she hadn't cried. But when she lost the bracelet, she cried, because that wasn't losing a piece of jewelry. That was losing her mother all over again. Maeve didn't know how long she sat there, maybe 5 minutes, maybe half an hour. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, took out her phone, and dialed the number. The phone rang twice. "Speak," Barrett's voice, brief and even, the same as always. "They took my bracelet," Maeve said. Her voice was hoarse, not trembling, but Barrett heard something in it that he had never heard from her before. An emptiness. Not weakness, the sound of someone who had just had the last thing that helped her keep standing taken away. Barrett was silent. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then he spoke, and his voice was different now. Lower, slower, heavier, like stone grinding just before a mountain gives way. "I'll get it back." Barrett didn't wait until morning. 20 minutes after Maeve's call, he was already sitting in the car, Flint driving, with 2 more men in the car behind them. No one said anything. Flint looked once into the rearview mirror and saw Barrett's face completely flat. Not angry, not hurried, showing nothing at all. And Flint knew that was the worst sign. If Barrett shouted, the other side still had a chance. When Barrett went silent, the other side should start praying. The car stopped in front of the old commercial building in Chinatown, where Vickers Financial Solutions had its office on the 6th floor. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. There was no receptionist at this hour. The elevator went straight up to the 6th floor. Ronan's office door was locked. Barrett looked at Flint. Flint kicked once, and the door flew open. Ronan Vickers was sitting behind the oak desk, phone in hand, clearly having just received a call from his men reporting that the job in the alley had been completed. When the door burst open and Barrett walked in, Ronan flinched, but he regained his composure faster than he had last time. Last time, he had been afraid. This time, he had Sloane backing him, inside information, and the confidence of a man who believed his opponent was growing weak. He set the phone down, leaned back in his chair, and spoke in the voice he had been rehearsing in his head all week for this moment. "Barrett, it's late, and you're still visiting an old friend?" Barrett didn't answer. He stood in the middle of the room, both hands hanging at his sides, watching Ronan with eyes that held nothing except patience wearing thin. Seeing that Barrett didn't react, Ronan grew more confident and continued, "I think you're losing focus, Barrett. A waitress? Seriously? She's making you soft. The Barrett Grayson from before wouldn't drive across town in the middle of the night for a cheap bracelet." Ronan gave a faint laugh, the kind of laugh men use when they are testing a boundary. "Maybe you should reconsider your priorities." Barrett still said nothing. He walked toward Ronan's desk, slowly, every step even, and with each step he took, the smile on Ronan's face faded a little more. Barrett reached the desk and looked down at the open laptop on the oak surface. He lifted the laptop with one hand, gently, as if lifting a book, then set it down on the floor, neatly, without throwing it, without tossing it. The act wasn't violent, but it carried more weight than any punch, because it said Barrett was clearing the table. And when Barrett cleared a table, whoever sat behind it should understand that he no longer had any rights over that table. Barrett placed both hands on the empty desktop, leaned forward, his face less than half a meter from Ronan's, and spoke very softly, so softly that even Flint, standing at the door, had to strain to hear him. "The bracelet. 30 seconds. No explanation. No threat. No statement about what he would do if Ronan didn't return it. Just 2 words and 1 number." And Ronan, looking into those gray eyes less than half a meter from his face, understood that everything Sloane had told him was wrong. Barrett wasn't soft. Barrett wasn't distracted. Barrett was standing in front of him, silent, patient, and absolutely ready for whatever would happen after those 30 seconds. The smile on Ronan's face died completely. He swallowed, looked toward Flint at the door, looked at the 2 men standing behind him, then looked back at Barrett. His hand opened the desk drawer, took out the small silver bracelet, and placed it on the tabletop. The 2 letters, Z and M, glinted beneath the office lights. Barrett picked up the bracelet, slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, then straightened. He looked at Ronan for 1 more second and said, "You've just used up the last time I come here to talk." Then he turned and walked out, without looking back. In the car, on the way back, Barrett took the bracelet from his jacket pocket. He opened his palm and let the silver bracelet rest there beneath the streetlights shining through the window. The letters Z and M were on the front, small, faded, engraved by hand. He turned the bracelet over, blank. The silver back was smooth, with nothing on it. Barrett looked at that empty back for a long time, longer than he had looked into Ronan's eyes, then closed his hand around the bracelet and stared out the car window. Flint didn't ask. He drove straight to Bridgeport. Barrett knocked on the door of the 3rd-floor studio at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Maeve opened it, her eyes swollen, her cheek bruised, her hair still tangled. She looked at Barrett standing at her door in a black suit, his face still and unreadable, and he held out his hand. In his palm was the silver bracelet. Maeve looked at the bracelet. She didn't ask how he had gotten it back. She didn't ask whether Ronan was all right. She didn't ask anything at all. She took the bracelet, and her hand trembled so badly that she had to use her other hand to steady her wrist before fastening it on. When the bracelet closed around her wrist, when she felt its familiar weight against her skin, she lifted her eyes to Barrett and said, "Thank you." 2 words. Not reluctant, not forced, not followed by, "But I'll pay you back." It was the first time she had ever said those 2 words to him and meant them. Barrett nodded, then turned toward the stairs. "Barrett," Maeve called. He stopped, his back still turned to her, one hand on the railing. "I'm not leaving, and I'm not sitting around waiting for them to come a 3rd time." Barrett was silent for 1 second. Then, without turning back, he said, "I know." Then he walked down the stairs, his shoes tapping softly in the dark, fading farther and farther away, until the ground-floor door closed, and Maeve stood alone in front of her studio, turning the silver bracelet around her wrist. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel alone. 2 quiet weeks passed, so quiet that Barrett should have been suspicious. No word from Ronan, no move from Sloane. Greystone Restaurant operated as usual, Maeve worked as usual, and Barrett's businesses ran as usual. Everything lay flat and still, like the surface of a lake before a storm. But Barrett had just lost his father, recovered the bracelet, drawn a boundary with Sloane, and he was handling too many things at once to realize that the quiet wasn't a sign of peace. It was the sign of someone holding their breath before striking. On Friday evening, around 7 o'clock, Flint's phone rang. A senior member of the Grayson organization, someone who had followed Conrad from the earliest days, called to report that the northern warehouse in Rogers Park was being searched by the police. Sensitive goods were still inside, and someone with authority needed to come handle it immediately before the police opened the container. Flint reported it to Barrett. Barrett was sitting in the car on the way to Greystone. He thought for 1 second, then said, "Flint, go handle it. Rogers Park needs someone who knows how to talk to the police, not someone who knows how to drive. Go, I'm going to the restaurant. Nothing's going to happen." Flint hesitated. "Let me call someone else to Rogers Park. I'll stay with you." Barrett shook his head. "Greystone Restaurant, Michigan Avenue, my territory. No one would dare do anything there." Flint looked at Barrett in the rearview mirror, saw how certain he was, and nodded. He dropped Barrett off at Greystone, then drove north. Barrett walked into the restaurant at 7:30. Maeve was standing at the reception counter, checking the reservation list. She looked up when he passed, gave a slight nod, then turned back to her work. Barrett sat at his usual corner table by the window overlooking the alley, ordered black coffee, and opened his phone to read the news. The restaurant was quieter than usual tonight, with only about 1/3 of the tables occupied. Maeve noticed it, frowned at the reservation book, and saw 3 groups had canceled at the last minute without giving a reason. She found it strange, but she didn't think too much of it. At 8:15, the last group of guests paid and left. The staff began cleaning up. Maeve went into the kitchen to check the closing procedures with the chef. Barrett was still sitting at the corner table, his coffee long empty, his phone face down on the table. 8:23. The lights at the front of the restaurant went out. Not slowly, not the way lights went off at closing time. They snapped off all at once, the entire strip of front lights and the sign lights together. Inside, the restaurant was still lit, but the black glass front suddenly sank into darkness. Barrett looked up from his phone. His eyes went to the darkened glass doors, and in 1/10 of a second, he saw 3 figures moving fast outside. Barrett stood at once, shoved the table over toward the front door as a barricade, and shouted toward the staff standing near the bar, "Everyone to the kitchen door. Go, now." His voice wasn't panicked. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough that no one dared stay and ask why. 4 servers and 2 bartenders ran toward the kitchen. The front glass doors exploded. 3 men rushed in, each one holding a handgun. They stepped over the shattered glass, scanning the restaurant, looking for their target. Barrett had already moved. He didn't stand still and wait. When the glass broke, he ran along the wall toward the electrical panel behind the bar, and while the 3 gunmen were still searching for him among the overturned tables, Barrett pulled the main breaker. The entire restaurant dropped into complete darkness. The streetlight outside spilled in through the shattered glass frame, only enough to scatter patches of light and shadow across the floor, not enough to see anyone clearly. But Barrett didn't need to see. He had sat in this restaurant hundreds of nights. He knew where every table, every chair, and every column stood. He knew the distance from the bar to the kitchen door was 14 steps. He knew the middle row held 8 tables arranged in 2 lines. He knew the stainless steel food cart was always parked beside the 3rd column, 5 steps from the kitchen door. He moved among the tables like a ghost, not hurried, not running, every step exact. The first man felt his way into the bar area, gun raised in front of him, his eyes not yet adjusted to the dark. Barrett was already behind the 3rd column, both hands gripping the handle of the steel cart. When the man passed, Barrett shoved the cart with all his strength. The cart slammed straight into the gunman's side, knocking him face down, his weapon skidding across the tile floor. Barrett stepped forward, kicked the gun away, then grabbed the man by the collar and drove his face down against the floor. The second man heard the noise, turned his gun toward the bar, and fired once. The bullet punched into the wall behind it. Barrett was no longer there. He moved along the middle row of tables, circled behind the second man from the left, grabbed the wrist holding the gun, and twisted hard. The gun fell. Barrett locked the man's arm behind his back and shoved his face into the nearest tabletop. The third man fired toward the sound. The bullet skimmed past Barrett's shoulder and buried itself in the chair behind him. Barrett lifted the wooden chair beside him, held it in front of his body, and charged straight toward the flash at the muzzle. The chair crashed into the gunman, and both of them went down to the floor. Barrett threw the chair aside, pinned him down, and fought for the gun. But this man was bigger, stronger, and he bucked upward, driving his elbow into Barrett's left ribs. A clean hit. Barrett felt something pierce through the fabric of his suit jacket and into his side, hot and sharp. He folded, dropped to one knee, his left hand pressing against his ribs, feeling warmth seep between his fingers. The third man struggled up, backed away, picked up the gun from the floor, and aimed it at Barrett, who was kneeling in the middle of the dark restaurant. At the same moment, in Rogers Park, Flint arrived at the northern warehouse and found the gate shut tight. No police, no inspection, nothing at all. He stood in front of the empty warehouse gate, looked at his phone, and understood. Flint called Barrett. No answer. Called a second time. No answer. Flint ran back to the car, started the engine, and drove like a madman toward Michigan Avenue. When the sound of breaking glass exploded at the front of the restaurant and Barrett shouted, "Everyone to the kitchen door," Maeve didn't run out with the staff. She pushed 4 servers through the kitchen door, shouted, "Run straight out to the back alley. Don't turn around," then stayed in the kitchen. Not because she was brave, because she heard gunfire from the front and knew Barrett was out there alone. She searched for her phone to call the police, but the phone was in the pocket of her coat, in the staff locker out in the hallway, and the hallway sat between the kitchen and the area where the sounds of fighting were coming from. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, her heart pounding, her hand gripping the edge of the stainless steel counter, trying to think. Then the back kitchen door opened. Ronan Vickers walked in, with one of his men behind him. The man turned his back to guard the rear door, a handgun angled down in his hand. Ronan walked straight into the kitchen, looked around, and saw Maeve standing beside the stove, her back against the steel rack. He held a gun in his right hand, but he didn't point it directly at her. He only let it hang at his side, the way a man holds something when he knows he has power and doesn't need to show it off. He looked at her and smiled, the smile of a man who had waited a very long time for this moment. "We meet again," Ronan said. "This time, there's no Barrett Grayson to save you." Then, one more person stepped into the kitchen behind Ronan. Sloane Mercer, wearing a long black coat, her hair pinned neatly back, her face calm as if she were attending a dinner party instead of standing in the middle of an ambush. Sloane stood beside Ronan, looked at Maeve, and spoke in that familiar, gentle voice. "You think Barrett loves you, Maeve? You're just the stray cat he picked up for amusement. Barrett Grayson doesn't love anyone. He collects. And when he gets bored, he throws things away. Just like he throws away everything that's no longer useful." Maeve looked at Sloane, then at Ronan, then at the gun in his hand. Ronan took one step forward, his voice impatient. "Listen carefully. Come with me quietly, or I'll drag you out. Your choice." Maeve didn't answer right away. She stood with her back against the steel rack, her right hand hanging at her side, right beside the commercial stove, where a heavy cast-iron pan lay on the rack. She looked at Ronan, then at Sloane, and she said, her voice steady, not raised, flat and clear, "I've lived my whole life with other people telling me who I am. The lending company said I'm a debtor. The thugs said I'm weak. You said I'm only an employee." She looked straight into Sloane's eyes. "I'm a debtor, someone no one needs, a stray cat. I've heard enough. Today, it ends." Maeve's left hand seized the cast-iron pan from the stove rack, heavy, black, forged from solid iron. She swung it with all her strength into Ronan's right wrist, the wrist holding the gun. The sound of metal striking bone was dry and clean. Ronan screamed. The gun flew from his hand and slid across the stainless steel kitchen floor. Ronan clutched his wrist and stumbled back 2 steps, his face twisting with pain. The man guarding the door heard the scream, turned around, and rushed into the kitchen. Maeve grabbed the stainless steel tray from the counter beside her and hurled it straight into his face. The tray struck his forehead. He staggered, and the gun in his hand dropped lower. Maeve didn't wait for him to regain his balance. She ran straight for the door connecting the kitchen to the main dining room. She shoved the door open and saw the scene ahead of her. In the pitch-dark restaurant, with only streetlight spilling through the shattered glass frame, Barrett was kneeling on the floor, one hand pressed against his left side, while the third gunman stood 2 meters away from him, a gun aimed straight at him. Barrett lifted his head, saw Maeve at the kitchen door, and his eyes widened, not with relief, but with fear. For the first time, Maeve saw something like fear in those gray eyes, and that fear wasn't for himself. It was for her. Maeve didn't stop. On the wall beside the kitchen door, within arm's reach, A red fire extinguisher hung on its bracket. She ripped it free, pulled the pin, aimed the nozzle at the gunman, and squeezed. A stream of white foam blasted straight into his face. He twisted away, one hand covering his eyes, temporarily blinded, his gun dropping lower. Barrett forced himself up on one hurting knee, lunged forward, slammed him face down onto the floor, tore the gun away, and drove his face against the tile. Then silence. The restaurant was black. The three gunmen lay on the floor. Barrett knelt among the overturned tables and chairs, his left hand pressed against his side. Maeve set the fire extinguisher down, stepped over the broken glass, and knelt beside Barrett. She placed her hand over the wound in his ribs, pressed hard, and felt warmth seeping between her fingers. Barrett looked at her, his face tightening with pain, and said in a hoarse voice, "Are you crazy?" Maeve looked straight into his eyes, her hand still pressing hard against his side, and said, "You saved me once. I'm paying you back." Barrett wanted to say something, but he didn't get the chance. Tires screeched outside. Flint burst in through the shattered glass frame, gun in hand, his eyes sweeping quickly over the entire restaurant. He saw Barrett on the floor, Maeve kneeling beside him, the three men lying still, and understood everything in 2 seconds. "Boss, are you all right?" Barrett nodded. Flint turned toward the kitchen, where footsteps were rushing toward the back door. He ran into the kitchen and found Sloane Mercer trying to open the rear door to escape, her hands shaking, her high heels slipping on the wet kitchen floor. Flint blocked the door. Sloane stopped, looked at him, and for the first time, her perfectly calm face cracked. Not because Flint was holding a gun, because she knew that when Barrett got up from that restaurant floor, everything she had built over the past few months would collapse in a single night. In the days after that night, Barrett cleaned up everything with the cold precision of a man who had been doing this his entire life. Ronan Vickers was handed over by Flint to the federal police, along with 4 boxes of files Flint had quietly collected over many weeks. Loan contracts with illegal interest rates, recordings of threatening calls made to debtors, and security camera photographs showing his men assaulting people who couldn't afford to pay. Ronan was arrested at the hospital where he was being treated for his wrist, handcuffed to the hospital bed. Vickers Financial Solutions was shut down permanently. With Sloane, Barrett handled things differently. He didn't hand her over to the police because she was smart enough never to touch anything illegal directly. Instead, he severed every connection between the Grayson and Mercer families, erased the engagement, and revoked all access to internal systems and information. He met Sloane one last time, in the sitting room of her home in the Gold Coast, and said, "If you want power, find it somewhere else. Don't come back. This time, I'm letting you go. There won't be a next time." Sloane said nothing. She knew that "there won't be a next time" from Barrett Grayson's mouth wasn't an empty threat. As for the senior member who had betrayed him, the one who had reported the fake emergency to send Flint away, Barrett met with him privately in the West Loop office. He placed the full printout of messages and calls between the man and Sloane in front of him, then said, "You have 24 hours to disappear from Chicago. This is the last mercy I'm giving you, because my father once trusted you." The man stood, walked out of the room, and no one in the Grayson organization ever saw him again. 4 days after the ambush, Maeve was lying in a hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial, the same building where Conrad had died. Her left arm was bandaged from wrist to elbow, the wound left by the cast-iron pan cutting into her palm when she swung it into Ronan's wrist. Her left cheek was still bruised, but the swelling had gone down. She lay there staring at the white ceiling, listening to the steady blinking rhythm of the monitor, and thinking that hospitals smelled the same everywhere, like the smell she had breathed in 3 years earlier when she sat beside her mother's bed for the last time. Barrett sat in the chair beside her bed, his back straight, his left side tightly wrapped beneath his dress shirt. The doctor said he was lucky because the wound hadn't struck any internal organs, only torn the intercostal muscle. Barrett listened, nodded, then went straight to Maeve's room without returning to his own. He had been sitting there since morning, saying nothing. Maeve said nothing either. The two of them stayed in that hospital room in silence, listening to the machines and the nurse's footsteps in the hallway. And that silence wasn't heavy. It was a relief, the kind of silence shared by two people who had passed through the longest night and knew they were still here. Then Barrett moved. He reached into the pocket of the black suit jacket draped over the arm of the chair and took out the silver bracelet. Maeve turned her head to look. She recognized it immediately, the familiar letters Z and M on the front. But Barrett didn't give it to her right away. He held the bracelet in his hand, turned it over, and showed her the back. The back, the place that had once been empty and smooth, now held one small engraved letter in silver, in the same style and the same size as the Z and M on the front. The letter B. Maeve looked at that letter. On the front, Z and M, Zara and Maeve, mother and daughter. On the back, B. Barrett. She looked at that letter for a very long time, and she understood that he had taken the bracelet to be repaired over the past 4 days, had found a silversmith to engrave one more letter on the back, not on the front beside Z and M, but on the back, as if he knew he didn't belong there, didn't belong in the space between a mother and daughter, but still wanted to be somewhere on that bracelet, on the other side, quiet, not intruding, simply there. Barrett took Maeve's left wrist gently, avoiding the bandaged place, and fastened the bracelet around it, locked it. The familiar weight settled around her wrist. Then he said, his voice low and soft, almost a whisper, "I'm not replacing anyone in your life. I only want to stand beside you." Maeve looked at the bracelet on her wrist. Z and M were on the side she could see. B was on the side she knew was there, even without looking. Her hand trembled. Not from pain, because her wrist was bandaged and the pain medicine was still working. It trembled because of something else. Something she had forgotten the feeling of long ago, before her mother died, before she learned how not to cry, before she became the girl who slammed a soda bottle down on a bar counter and said, "I'm not saying it twice." Maeve Holloway, who hadn't cried through 3 years of paying debt, hadn't cried when she lost her job, hadn't cried when she was shoved down in a dark alley, hadn't cried when Sloane Mercer told her she was only an employee, was crying now. Tears ran silently down her bruised cheek and onto the white hospital pillow, and she didn't wipe them away. She wasn't crying because of pain, not because of fear, not because of hopelessness, the way she had that night in the alley when the bracelet was taken. She cried because, for the first time in so many years, someone wanted to stay. Not because she was weak and needed protecting, not because she was pitiful and needed saving, but because she was worthy of standing beside. Barrett said nothing more. He let her cry. He didn't wipe away her tears, didn't hold her, didn't say the comforting words both of them knew would be unnecessary. He only reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and rough, his knuckles marked with old scars from years of building an empire with fists and silence. Her hand was small, bruised, her fingers still cut from the cast-iron pan. The hand of the most powerful boss in Chicago held the hand of the girl who had once had nothing except a silver bracelet. And in that quiet hospital room, beneath the cold, white fluorescent light, those two hands held on to each other, and neither one let go first. 6 months after the night Greystone Restaurant was ambushed, a small coffee shop opened on a quiet street on the south side. Its sign was hand-painted wood, modest and unshowy, with only one word, Zara's. Maeve chose that name without explaining it to anyone, and she didn't need to explain. The shop was small, with 12 tables and a coffee bar made from old wood that Maeve had sanded and polished with her own hands. She hired 5 employees, all of them women in difficult circumstances, women who had knocked on doors everywhere and been turned away, women whose credit history or imperfect past had slammed every opportunity shut in front of them. Maeve didn't ask about their past during the interview. She asked only one question: "Do you want to work?" If the answer was yes, she handed them an apron and began training them that same day. On the wall of the shop, between exposed brick and wooden shelves, hung only one small photograph in a black frame. There was no face in the picture, only a hand wearing a silver bracelet while holding a white coffee cup. No caption, no name. Sometimes customers asked what the photograph meant, and Maeve only smiled and said, "Just a memory." Barrett Grayson was still Barrett Grayson. He didn't suddenly become a charitable businessman or a model citizen overnight. He still ran the Grayson empire, still sat in VIP rooms at nightclubs, still told men who owed money, "You have 48 hours. But something was changing, slowly, quietly, like the crack in the surface of stone that he touched every night when he sat alone in his office. He began moving some operations gradually toward legitimacy. Not all of them, not right away, and not because anyone forced him, but because every night, when he sat still in the dark, his father's question still echoed back to him. "Are you living the right way?" Barrett hadn't found the answer to that question yet. Maybe he never would. Not completely. But he was trying. And for a man like Barrett Grayson, The act of trying alone was a revolution. Maeve and Barrett didn't live together like a fairy tale. There was no grand wedding, no white mansion with a wooden fence, no glowing golden sunset on a beach. They lived truthfully, with scars on their bodies, with a past that couldn't be erased, with nights when Maeve woke from dreams of her mother, and nights when Barrett sat in his car outside the cemetery, staring at his father's headstone without stepping out. But every morning, when Maeve opened Zara's at 6 o'clock, Barrett was already sitting at the small corner table by the window, a cup of black coffee in front of him, reading the news on his phone. No one knew when he arrived. He was simply there, every morning, in that exact place. And every morning, Maeve walked past his table, rested her hand on his shoulder for 1 second, then moved on to work. No words, no need for words. That 1 second was enough. Some people come into your life not to fix you, but to stand beside you while you learn to rise on your own. A person's worth doesn't lie in the debt on their shoulders or the circumstances they were born into, but in how many times they choose to stand up after being knocked down. And sometimes, the most precious thing isn't being saved, but meeting someone who believes you're worthy of saving yourself. Maeve and Barrett's story ends here, but out there, many people are still holding tightly to their own bracelet, still trying to stand after being knocked down in ways no one ever sees. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the new stories we bring you every day. How did this story make you feel? Leave a comment and share what comes from deep within your heart. We're always listening to every line you send us. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.